From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden, with weeks left in his term, blocks a Japanese acquisition of U.S. Steel while putting millions of acres of waters off limits for fossil fuel drilling, which President Trump says he'll reverse on day one. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. Japan's Nippon Steel is the fourth largest steelmaker in the world, and it had hoped to grow and also to build its business in the U.S. with a $14 billion acquisition of Pittsburgh's ailing U.S. Steel. Nippon had promised to invest in the U.S. It had also promised that it wouldn't reduce steel production within the U.S. without the government's permission. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which reviews business deals like this, spent months considering this takeover before deadlocking on it. But finally, on Friday, President Biden moved to block the acquisition. Here's a piece of what he said. "We need major U.S. companies representing the major share of U.S. steelmaking capacity to keep leading the fight on behalf of America's national interests. As a committee of national security and trade experts across the executive branch determined, this acquisition would place one of America's largest steel producers under foreign control and create risk for our national security and our critical supply chains." Unquote. Alicia, what do you make of the president's argument there? And why did he block this deal, particularly given all the promises that Nippon Steel had made?
Right. So he actually had promised going back to the spring to block the deal right after Donald Trump came out against it. This seems to be a case of economic nationalism going off the rails. The theory here, and again, the president doesn't really spell out why he's blocking it, but it's presumptively because a Japanese company is buying up a U.S. company. It's an iconic company, and they don't want that to happen. Nonetheless, Nippon has promised to invest $2.7 billion in reviving and updating U.S. steel plants, that some of which would otherwise have to close. It has even agreed to honor the existing collective bargaining agreements with the United Steelworkers Union. It has promised $5,000 in bonuses, and the deal actually had a lot of support from the rank and file steel workers. The problem was United Steelworkers boss, David McCall, opposed it, and so did his company, Cleveland-Cliffs, which is U.S. Steel's chief competitor. And the allegations that Nippon laid out in a lawsuit, and a couple of lawsuits on Monday, is that basically Cleveland-Cliffs was in bed with U.S. Steel because they want to monopolize the U.S. steel market in order to drive up prices. And actually, I think the evidence is pretty compelling that that's what happened.
Interesting reporting from the Journal recently. Here's the top of the news story. President Biden went against top national security aides when deciding to tank a Japanese takeover of U.S. Steel and instead aligned with his domestic advisors to bolster his pro-union legacy. Kim, there are many ironies in here. One of them, obviously, is that Japan is a close ally of the United States and has been for a long time. Almost simultaneously with blocking this deal, the State Department said that it had approved about $3.6 billion in sales of advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles to Japan, 1,200 missiles, associated guidance sections. So the notion that foreign investment in the U.S., a foreign steelmaker coming in and saying that they are going to keep U.S. plants open, promising not to cut production. By the way, domestic U.S. steel production is much greater than direct military needs. We saw that in the controversy, the debate over Trump's tariffs in his first term. The Defense Department saying that it only needs about 3%, if I recall the figure, of annual U.S. steel production. Kim, I find it hard to explain this other than, as Alicia says, kind of a sop to the union leaders in Joe Biden's Democratic Party.
Yeah, Joe Biden's own words show that, in that he's now talking out of both sides of his mouth or reversing himself on a number of things that he claims have been important guiding principles of his presidency. I mean, this is a man who stands up constantly and brags that he's the one that restored alliances with allies around the world, so much cooperation. And as you note, Kyle, who is one of our greatest allies when it comes to containing China's potential in the Pacific? It's Japan. We obviously just did that air-to-air missile deal, but Joe Biden has otherwise tried to tout our alliance with Japan, and yet now here we are sticking a giant finger in Japan's eye. That's the joke about all this too, is there is nothing in here that can suggest this is in any way a risk to our national security. Quite the opposite. The other is that this is administration. I mean, my goodness, how many companies have they sued? Alicia probably has a list claiming that they're too big of a monopoly, that they really shouldn't be any larger. It's bad for consumers. And yet this is an administration that seems to be advocating for the union's preferred outcome, which would be a tie-up with Cleveland-Cliffs. Were that to happen, you would have essentially a domestic cartel in certain areas, 100% of blast furnace production, 100% of domestic steel that goes into electric vehicles, enormous proportion of other domestic steel that is used in vehicles, presenting a wall against other competitors. So this was done entirely in the name of a SOP for unions. Even though we could get into this, it will likely be very bad for workers down the road, at least those who work for U.S. Steel, which really needs some infusion of new capital and some changes in the way it does things.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Alicia, what do you make of the alternatives facing U.S. Steel if this acquisition at a pretty good price ends up being blocked? And on the point about a potential tie-up between Cleveland-Cliffs and U.S. Steel, those figures that Kim was citing, 100% control of certain areas of the domestic steel market, that sounds like something that Lena Khan at the FTC would have a problem with in a different section of the Biden administration.
Right. And actually, Cleveland-Cliffs has been going on an acquisition binge lately in the last several years and has actually been buying up rivals on the cheap. And that's how it already has a huge share of many of these markets. It actually already currently has about 100% of the electric steel market that goes into electric vehicle motors as well as power transformers, which are key. And actually, you've already been hearing complaints from these industries about how its monopoly control has been driving up prices. Now, as I was saying, I think the allegations are actually pretty credible that the United Steelworkers and the Cleveland-Cliffs kind of are conspired. And the allegation in this lawsuit is that the strategy was merge or murder. So if Cleveland-Cliffs, which had made a bid for U.S. Steel last year, it was outbid by Nippon Steel, which made a better offer, an all-cash offer. So Cleveland-Cliffs lost out. So now its strategy seems to be to actually drive U.S. Steel into bankruptcy. And as actually the CEO has suggested as much, because this Nippon Steel deal might be the only way to actually salvage the company as a whole, because the U.S. Steelworkers boss has said he won't let any company besides Cleveland-Cliffs buy the company. And so potentially what you could have is just U.S. Steel going bankrupt and then Cleveland-Cliffs coming in and buying up some of its assets and plants on the cheap, which would be much cheaper, again, than it would have been just to acquire the whole company. And I'd also point out one thing is that Cleveland-Cliffs has a history of laying off workers after buying up plants. In fact, that's one of the reasons why you've actually seen a decline in American steel employment over the last several years, is because Cleveland-Cliffs, which is now the dominant manufacturer, has been laying off workers because it doesn't have the capital to reinvest in these plants. So President Biden scuttling this deal is really going to hurt workers.
Kim, what do you make of the broader question here, the corruption of the CFIUS review process? I think many Americans can understand the need for that kind of a national security safeguard. If there's a foreign company that wants to come into the U.S. and buy a U.S. company, we're having a simultaneous discussion in the U.S. about the wisdom of having a Chinese-owned social media app, TikTok, that is used by something like 170 million Americans in a given month. That is not under this Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. process. That's a different piece of legislation that is going to to the Supreme Court later this week. But the issues are somewhat similar. And this is supposed to be, I think, a real good faith national security evaluation on the merits. And the fact that Biden has weighed in here now and it seems put politics before the real national security merits, I worry that that's going to give other businesses pause. If there's a company that is Japanese automaker, let's say, that thinks that there's some economic wisdom, efficiencies to be had, gains to be had in buying some sort of parts supplier in the U.S., just to make up an example, improve their procedures, improve their processes, integrate a little bit better with the automaker's own plants, it's going to have to worry now that it will go through the motions of making a bid, making an offer, getting some sort of deal that is getting some sort of tie-up that is public and approved, and then politics is going to wade in here. Is there a concern that it could chill investment?
Oh, absolutely. The precedent here is very concerning, and the history is really notable. Gerald Ford created CFIUS, but it was essentially meant to be a body that wrote reports and talked about foreign investment and potential national security concerns. In 1988, Congress decided to essentially expand authority to give the power to the president to block certain deals that might be of national security concern. But interestingly, one of the early versions of that legislation debated letting the president do so on the grounds of something being essential commerce. And that was pushed back against by the Reagan administration. And Congress very wisely instead decided to do national security. And yet what we see here is this president essentially conflating national security with economic nationalism in a way. It's notable to me that CFIUS in the end kind of bounced this decision to Biden because it was undecided on the question. And so what we have is the president plowing ahead, as you note, overruling a number of his advisors to side with those saying he needed to do this for unions and setting this new standard where you can say, look, if an industry is essentially important to America. I mean, by the way, what industry isn't important to America? Usually, I've decided this industry is particularly important to America, and therefore we can't allow any foreign investment in it. That's a very slippery slope. I worry that two things. One, it sets a standard for future presidents, including Donald Trump, to come in and define yet more areas of our national economy or our economy as somehow too vital to have foreign investment. But two, the terrible message it sends to foreign investors, including our allies. And again, let's round that back again. This is not like Iran is offering to take over U.S. Steel or Russia is offering to take over U.S. Steel. This is a respected, well-managed company that works in one of our greatest allies in the Pacific, Japan. And I think we are making a real muddle of what the clear idea behind this was at its beginning.